Currently, when you try to use ChatGPT, when you try to use pretty much any AI agent, you have to tell it so many things, and it gets tedious. It's like you just came and talked to some colleague, right? Like, hey, this is what we should do, X, Y, and Z. Like, this is the shape of it, all these things. Then you have to go parrot it back out to ChatGPT. Imagine you had systems which, could see and hear and understand all the time. In that realm, I feel like you have nearly perfect context, and you have models that are able to attend to that context. And you have systems like what Luma is building, where it is able to create and visualize things and reason through this extremely complex context of people's emotions, of visual worlds, of text, of information, all those kind of things. And I imagine, right, that's what ideal computer looks like. But also means now my computer knows almost as much about me as I do. It already is getting there. Your phone knows more about you than your mom does. But can it get to a place where it knows as much about me as my brain does? I think that's kind of what we want to get to. I think that looks very exciting.
Right, Amit, I'm so excited to have you on here. I saw you in person yesterday, so we get 2 days in a row. Thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Bar. Great to be here.
I want to actually talk, before we move backwards and before we talk about present day, I want to talk about your vision for the future of Luma. Luma Dream Machine today is an AI model that makes realistic videos quickly from text and images. And you've described Dream Machine as a step towards building a universal imagination engine. So what is your dream for Dream Machine? Maybe in other words, at the limit, what does a universal imagination engine look like?
Yeah. So the problem I think that exists today that we want to really solve in the future is that intelligence is starting with text. And I think that's great, right? Because text is extremely compressed, has a lot of logical structures of our thinking, of our reasoning, of our history, all those kind of things. But text alone is really not enough. So the future we want looks a little bit more like the holodeck. Computers at that time look a little bit, if you're not familiar with the holodeck from Star Trek. Actually, I did meet an engineer recently who was not familiar with the holodeck. And I was very...
I was going to say, how rare is that someone doesn't know what the holodeck is?
It is rare, but it is not, never actually. And I was very surprised. But yeah, if you're not familiar with it, right, computers have been going in this direction of yes, textual information, DOS era, to more and more and more visual interfaces wherever possible. People prefer those. People tend to spend most of their time in even for shopping activities. Like people are doing that on YouTube. People are doing that a lot on TikTok. People are doing that a lot on Instagram. Wherever possible, people gravitate towards visual interfaces, towards visual ways of doing things. I think the future of computing, the future of interactions, the future of accessing information looks like you have a great model that is able to talk to the internet, that is able to generate really, really powerful visuals, and that is able to reason. And then you have a computer with a great screen and that connection to the internet, and that is able to run that model, that is able to talk to the internet wherever the larger versions of that model is running. And that's basically it. It is a universal engine that is able to take all this information and display it in whatever format is great for you. And second bit, it's interactive, right? So it's not just passive video that is coming about you, but rather it is a place where you can actually interact with it, what you want it to be, that sort of stuff. So that's sort of how we see getting there, and then that future starts to look very different. The future starts to look like a computer which is for our daily use. You're able to work with a lot of complex information, with a lot of fun information for entertainment, for companionship, all those kind of things. So yeah, that's how I see it.
What does reasoning look like in this world? You mentioned the model should be able to reason.
I mean, not terribly different from what we are doing today, right? So reasoning is this forever goalpost. It keeps getting moved, right? It's like, okay, forming coherent, cogent sentences was considered the bar for reasoning. But obviously, language models can do that now very, very trivially, and suddenly that's not reasoning. So it is this moving goalpost that people keep redefining, and I think that it's synonymous with intelligence in my mind. But if you were to define reasoning from the perspective of an end user, of like someone who cares about it, who's using it, right? Like, they don't need to know the word. Reasoning means being able to understand what is expected of it and then being able to reason through and perform those actions. Now, performing is maybe not reasoning, right? You can maybe decide, like, oh, these are things I should be able to do, but you might not be able to do it. As a system, you might not be capable for it.
Sure. But you understand the intent and you're able to reason about what needs to be done, even if you can't execute on it.
Exactly right. And so in this world, you asked, like, what does reasoning look like in this world? So let's talk about what this world is, right? This world is about a set of models or a universal model that has been pre-trained on audio, video, language, and basically humanity's entire digital footprint, right? So we believe that actually leads to way better reasoning capabilities than whatever we have in LLMs. What we have in LLMs is substantially better than what we had in, like, previous generation of the models, but it's still extremely gated. So if you're interested in that, we can talk about, like, why that is and how it would look differently. But I want to emphasize, like, if you're able to observe that much more data and that much more correlated data, you have way better reasoning capabilities.
And you said one thing, you said it could be a set of models or a universal model. What's your bet on which one of those, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah. I think you and I talked about this yesterday
We
briefly.
did talk about it yesterday.
Um,
A leading question.
a leading question, exactly right.
A leading
So
question.
I, I think, like, what's really interesting is how do you define the set of models? If you are thinking about it in terms of capabilities, that you have a family of models, and model A is good at tasks of this kind, model B is good at tasks of separate category, model C is good at tasks of separate categories, and somehow you assemble them together into one system that is universally good at all those things. Honestly, the better lesson, if you're familiar with the better lesson, if your audience is not, please go read it. That's basically the Bible of AI. Better lesson from Rick Sutton. It's an essay that you can find online. But I just don't see that approach of, like, these multiple models that are individually trained on specific tasks coming together and doing them really well. Because very simply, unless you're able to jointly train and backprop through, right? It's very difficult to imagine how the sum of the parts is better than the parts themselves, right? And we're seeing that, we have seen that in the past eras of machine learning, like, with computer vision, people try to combine all these systems together, and, like, then the boundaries were very fragile. Like, a concrete example of that is autonomy, right? People tried to make autonomous cars by piecing together all these systems, deep learning systems for perception. Then there were systems that were responsible for making decisions and, like, vectorizing the data and then making decisions on it. Then there were models responsible for taking those decisions and turning them into, like, actions, or not models but systems. But all of that never worked. It didn't start working until we tried to, like, unify that into, like, as much of the same system in one brain as possible, right? I very, like, I'm open to changing my mind on this, but I currently, based on the evidence I have, I very strongly believe that this kind of architecture is what we have. So if I had to choose between a family of task-specific, task-oriented models versus a large single brain, I would heavily choose a large single brain. And this also comes from, like, how the models are architected, right? Attention. If you're able to pay attention to all the data and then cross attend to different modalities and self attend to, like, the pieces within that, like, paragraphs, within the videos, within things like this, you just come out with way better learning and way better understanding. So on that one axis of capabilities, I believe there's going to be one, like, universal models will win out. Then on the axis of small versus large, I mean, yeah, that's like, you can distill them out into smaller models for different use cases you have, and you can, like, prune out some of the capabilities. I think that's all fine. That's just engineering.
No, makes sense. And maybe before we get into a little bit on how do you actually train this universal model, and before we get into some of the long vision that we talked about, let's back up to how we got here and how you built this POV. So I think one way to understand that is the origin story of Luma. I know at Apple you worked on some of the most cutting edge technology. So what attracted you to working on Vision Pro and going very deep in computer vision in the first place?
Yeah. So my academic background is in physics and math, and I've done an immense amount of work on physical simulation. So most of experimental physics and the kind of physics that most of the universities pursue now, outside of theoretical realms, is very heavy on simulation because it's just cheaper and you can try out a billion ideas, right? Again, sometimes is the only place you can try out some of the ideas. So I understand the power and potential of what is possible if you're able to bring what is done in atoms into bits, right? So what attracted me to Vision Pro is very similar because well, I was at Apple and we were working on some of the AI things within Siri at that time. And of course, this was a secret effort that was going on. Everything at Apple is that way. And you see, some great people starting to move into this black hole. I was like, what is going on? So you just need a little bit of sleuthing skills at Apple, and you can learn most of the things. So I found out about this effort, and obviously this is very close to my heart because Vision Pro, what it is today and what it will be in the future, but the underlying idea is that computing is not this thing that is limited to a screen, to a place, or to a device, basically. It's already so pervasive in our lives. We already try to bring computing everywhere, right? This thing cannot escape from me, basically. So what if it's really actually pervasive, and two, we don't have to keep reminding you to check your phone because by sending you notifications,
You
but
don't have to
rather,
remind me, but yes.
but uh, but rather that you're able to basically have systems that show information as it's relevant in the moment and get out of the way when not necessary. Immerse you entirely when you actually want it to be, like you're watching a movie, when you're watching, having a great time with your friends, those kind of things. So that was a very attractive prospects. And when I realized that hey, my skills on systems engineering and deep learning would be very valuable to this group, there was a no brainer.
How do you see the long vision we talked about for the universal imagination engine interfacing with new computing interfaces? Or kind of where does the intersection of AR, VR, and AI shape how we interact with and create content?
Create content is interesting. I'm going to pull on that for just a second.
All right, we'll put a pin in it.
I actually quite dislike the content approach that most people are taking here, right? So, if we be pedantic and we look at the definition of the word content, it's filling something, right? Like it's contents of something, and that something generally tends to be time. And so what can fill the internet? What can fill my time? All those kind of things. I think with all these things that we're building today, we will enter an era where most of the content of your time or what you spend your time on is going to be very personal. It's going to be like something specifically made for you. And the evidence for that today is you see Netflix shows that are just so esoteric become so popular with certain groups, right? And you have never heard of it, what I watch, and I have never heard of what you are watching, right? And that's intentional because and instead of making lowest common denominator things, lowest common denominator content, it's just specific to you, and that's so great, right? Of course, we should have common things too, so we can talk about them and have fun about it. But that is my view of that. So coming back to the AR VR part of it, right? Yeah, I think of course hardware is a big problem on AR VR, and we like a lot of people are working, very smart people are working on figuring out how do we get it to be as close to this thing as possible, right? People clearly seem okay with the idea of wearing glasses. Some of us not because they put on contacts, because they think glasses are not so fun. But even they will wear sunglasses at some point. So in my mind, this form factor is extremely compelling because it's societally accepted. It sees what you see, which is extremely important for context, right? Currently, when you try to use ChatGPT, when you try to use pretty much any AI agent, you have to tell it so many things and it gets tedious. It's like you just came and talked to some colleague, right? Like, hey, this is what we should do, X, Y, and Z. Like, this is the shape of it, all these things. And then you have to go parrot it back out to ChatGPT. Imagine you had systems which, could see and hear and understand all the time. Um, and of course, privacy has implications of that, but like, who cares? Future has no privacy in this imaginary world. Of course, like, we'll figure out the actual frameworks for privacy and all those kind of things. But in this imaginary world, let's imagine, we don't care. In that realm, I feel like you have nearly perfect context. I think computers have forever been missing, and you have models that are able to attend to that context. And you have systems like what Luma is building, where it is able to create and visualize things and reason through this extremely complex context of people's emotions, of visual worlds, of text, of information, all those kind of things. And I imagine, right, that's what ideal computer looks like. At least that's like the ambient computer that you have, right? Like that you forever have on you. You don't have to constantly, burrow through thousands of apps, thousands of screens to go get your day or information from your day. But also means now like my computer knows almost as much about me as I do. It already is getting there. Your phone knows more about you than your mom does, but can it get to a place where it knows as much about me as my brain does? I think that's kind of what we want to get to, and I think that looks very exciting.
Do you spend a lot of time thinking about hardware now still?
No, I don't. Because the kind of work we're doing is so deeply involved and so technical. Like, I do spend a lot of time thinking about hardware, but that just means GPUs.
Yeah, yeah. How do we scale our compute?
How do we scale our compute? How do we run it efficiently? How do we actually make the most utilization out of it? All those kind of things. But yeah, that's the only hardware I think about these days.
I always think about this too because I'm so addicted to my iPhone that any interface that I adopt needs to be better than use the ChatGPT example now. Kind of as GPT 4.0, for instance, gets better. Does the perception from carrying my phone around, what will be better than that? What interface will I prefer to that? But yeah, I wear sunglasses sometimes.
Do you think we will ever give up our phones?
Probably. If you ask me on what time scale, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I'm very bullish that I don't think we're going to give up our phones anytime soon.
You think we're with our phones forever?
But even if we have a really great on-face display and it's purely additive, it's very high fidelity, high definition, all those kind of things. I just think interaction still is very tough, and the phones are just a perfect form factor of doing things this way. So for certain things, we'll still keep them around, but it is possible that we do it less and less, and then become thinner and thinner, smaller and smaller, and one day just vanish.
I was gonna say the question's also like, what is a phone? The sense of the iPhone that I have today looks very different than the Razr phone I had. And so do some of the capabilities that I go and turn to my phone to use, do I do those set of capabilities mostly in other places? I could see that evolving. Okay, so if we rewind 3 years, you were at Apple, you work on Vision Pro for over 3 years now. How did you get interested in Nerfs and think to yourself, Nerfs are the future, let me go and start a company? Because that is where you began.
So actually, that was not a far stretch, honestly. While working on Vision Pro, the projects I was most involved with, and the projects I was working on were 3D photography, and how do we capture and bring the world that is outside into Vision Pro. And from Apple's perspective, it was from the perspective of memories, and spatial photos and videos are a thing on Vision Pro now. But the problem I was particularly, and I continue to be particularly very interested in, is all the things that we can do in atoms today. Can we do them in bits? Right? Whenever we can do things in bits, we can manipulate them endlessly. We can have 100 million versions of them. We can try out all the possibilities and combinations. So that was what I was learning while I was there, and that's what I was trying to do. And then of course building things like the rendering engines and avatars and those kind of things at Vision Pro. So in 2020, and of course we were using most of the traditional techniques, graphics techniques and computer vision techniques, because obviously what else would we do? But in 2020, two things happened, right? One was the Nerf paper from Matt Tansik, who's leading our applied research now. He was at Berkeley. Matt and John Barron and Ben Mildenhall, their paper came out, and then it was the DALL-E 1 paper from OpenAI, right? Again, and of course the demo. Honestly, that was huge because I think for the first time, we have had computer vision techniques. We have had detection and those kind of things. We also had GANs for making some images and those kind of things. But there was something about both of those approaches. Nerf showed that from a sample of the world, you go and capture a few images, you can actually go from that sample to photorealistic 3D, right? We had approaches with SLAM and other reconstruction based approaches where you could, like Colmab and all those things, right? You could get a 3D representation, but all of it always looked like data. It looked completely to another person. It's like, oh yeah, this point cloud, or this looks very jagged or very bad. But when you looked at Nerf samples, it just looked like a video someone took. But of course, it wasn't. It went through, reconstructed, and then rendered something out. So it was the glimpse into this future where you have a world in there, right, inside the computer, and now you're using math to sample that world. And that's crazy to me. And that's incredible. And after the paper came out and they were generous enough to release their code, within about 16 hours or so, I had it running, and we had our first things training, just personally, right? Not at Apple. And that was huge, because that was incredible. And the world has currently correctly recognized that it is one of the most incredible technologies. And second was DALL-E, which was coming at it from a different direction, but the same problem. It's like we now have this implicit representation that was trained from random images, right, on the internet with just some text conditioning. And there is a representation inside this model that we can sample using noise schedules or denoising, basically. And that's huge again. So it again comes down to those things. And once you had that, my personal mental model was everything we were doing was yeah, this is not gonna how the world's gonna look like, and we should stop wasting time on it. So that was late 2020. I left Apple in 2021, and with this idea, and then it was a very. The decision was I was having a really ball time at Apple. Honestly, I was having a lot of fun because we were building the future. Honestly, but when that moment happened, right, and then I completely poured myself into it on generative models, on Nerf, all those kind of things. And then it became either I try to convince this whole machine, this whole ship that is Apple, to change direction on that direction, or change to going towards that direction, or go find 15, 20 of the most brilliant people on the planet and try to build this ourselves.
Build your own ship.
Exactly, and of course, that's the story as old as time, and that's what most of the people do, who are entrepreneurial, who want to actually control their destiny. And so yeah, that was the moment where I was like, yeah, I should just leave. I'm going to start something, and we're going to see how far we can push it. And if you know Charlie Munger's quote on the jacket of his book, it was generally things that work out are you take one simple idea and you take it very seriously. So we took this one simple idea that hey, we want to be able to put the world into bits and be able to manipulate it and do things in it. And that was the genesis.
How did you then become very interested in these universal models that we talked about earlier? Was this a natural extension of focusing on 3D capture? At which point did you realize we need all these modalities together?
So, I mean, it was clear from early on that if you could train on it, you would train on everything. Right, but obviously in 2022, that was not even known. How do you actually do that? The best cards we had were A100 40 gigs, right, and then A180 gigs were kind of becoming available. Compute was very, very limited. Actually, V100 was the card du jour at that time. V100s were extremely anemic cards. Language models at the time looked barely a few 100 billion parameters, let alone your trillion parameter models that we have today. So it was extremely unknown how you do that. So you had to start with something, right, that is trainable. And what you do, so if you cannot work on the generalized representation of all the data, right, what you do is you try to find more specific representations that already have more information. So let me actually kind of take a detour and explain how we think about representations and general data and all those kind of things. So ideal scenario, the bit lesson approach, is general methods like transformers that are able to consume all the data and work on and then saturate all the compute that you actually can give it, right? That's what works. Now, if you operate in a regime where any of these three things are not true, like you don't have such scalable transformers, or you don't have that much compute, or you don't have that much data, you now need to teach or provide that information as inductive bias, right, to the model. Like, hey, don't learn this information. I know this information, so I'm going to give you this information. 3D is that kind of representation, right? But you're saying, hey, I know you have to learn that the world is 3D, but instead of learning that from data, I'm just going to tell you that the world is 3D by giving you 3D data to train. Consequently, you now need to train with less data. You now need to train with less compute, and you probably can get away without doing things like full self attention, which is extremely compute intensive, but also extremely rewarding when you come out of it. So, given that those were the constraints we had, we started with three. And we released a capture app that to just gather data. It's completely free, and it is the most popular 3D capture app in the world, and it currently generates more data in a month than existed, all 3D data that existed for all of humanity. So we were very aware that hey, data is going to be that linchpin that solves this problem. So we built a very strong product on that area, and we gave it to people, and we made it extremely delightful, and people use it for all kinds of things, like memories and production boards and those sort of things. But yeah, that's why we started there. But we were extremely clear that hey, the moment other modalities become trainable, that's where we're going to go. So that changed in early 2023.
I know there's a big effort. How do we just increase the available 3D data on which to train? Are there other modalities? Is that the biggest constraint?
No, I think 3D data is extremely valuable for learning certain things. But if you're focusing on 3D data, I think you've lost the plot. Basically, the digital footprint that humans have in images and videos is more than plenty. That's how our we have very strong evidence that that's basically sufficient. But yeah, you need to define and build the right architectures for it. You need to learn how to train on it. So in early 2023, on the heels of H100, we did back of the envelope, and we realized okay, video is going to become trainable in very short amount of time, right? 5-6 months from that. It was about the time when our chief scientist Jiaming joined us from NVIDIA, and he was training image and video models over there. He's the author of DDIM, diffusion implicit models, and our team was very small at that time. We had some incredible people who were coming from the 3D world with Jiaming, and then Matt joined us a month later, and we started this effort wholeheartedly to learn from video. And learning from video, I'll tell you, is extremely difficult. The volume of data, the infrastructure challenges it is, we can talk about it, if that is of interest to you.
I actually want to hear a little bit about the infrastructure that you built internally in order to build Dream Machine. And I think you were going down that route, but what is the biggest challenge in dealing with video data?
It's just voluminous, right? Visual data has a lot of redundancy. But the flip side of that is there's just a lot of it, a lot of it. So I'll give you a concrete example there, right? Language models let's say Llama 405B, Llama 70B, Llama, especially starting Llama 2, Llama 3 actually, starting Llama 3, they're trained on about 15 trillion tokens. Right, 15 trillion tokens is maybe 200, 300 terabytes, and that's just no data. I can I'll fit that on a small hard drive, honestly. On the other hand, we train Dream Machine V2 especially, that's out now, that was trained on 1.2 quintillion tokens. So, which is 1,200 trillion tokens, right? And of course, it's a very so for some people it might seem like a very facetious comparison, because text is so compressed and it's so efficient. So 15 trillion tokens of text, actually the information density is quite good. But when I say 15 trillion or this 800 billion to 1.2 quintillion tokens, this is after compression of video data, and we are very, very good at that part. So this is actually high information density, maybe not so high as text, but it's very high information density. And this data, is in tens and tens of petabytes. So when you need to think about how do you show your GPUs this much data? How do you shovel this much data through the batches such that the model actually is able to see a good variety of it? and is able to train on it, that's an infrastructure challenge of the size only some big companies so far have ever tackled, honestly. The methods we use, the infra we use looks a lot like Google scale infrastructure than it looks like what a startup might have access to.
It's interesting because we talked about the bitter lesson earlier. And so it sounds like part of it is massive, massive volumes of image and video data, text data, scaling compute in a commensurate way, doing all the tricks and research around how do you make this faster. I'm curious how much emphasis there actually is on, you started this partially because there was net new research in Nerfs. How much does it look like net new research and what these models look like at their core? And I'm not talking about efficiency gains, which I know are part of it. I'm talking about, I don't know, creativity versus aligning a model with intent. How much of it is building the infrastructure, building the scale, getting the data in the position you need versus continuing to explore different research routes that may take you in different directions?
So yeah, you're asking, is the path to this creative intelligence just engineering and scaling up? Or is there, we need to do science?
I was asking that, but you said it much better than I did. So perfect.
Oh,
Exactly.
well, thank you very much. But yeah, I think there's both to it, obviously. But the research side, we do an immense amount of research, basically. So I'll tell you why and what my thinking on that is. Language has now been scaled quite a bit, right? And a lot of work has been done on the research side of it and scaling transformers and scaling and the understanding of how do you make them very compliant and those kind of things. But still, in language land, there is so much work to be done. If you want to make models that are actually truly intelligent, first of all, it's not going to be done through language, right? Alone, at least. You need other modalities in play. And two, you need research to actually figure out how to combine these together, how to encode them correctly, how to pay attention to all of them. And second, how do you efficiently train with them? How do you make them trainable? That's the sentence basically. How do you make them efficiently trainable? And it might sound like an engineering problem, but it is an extreme research problem. Honestly, I don't mean the risk in that research is extreme, but rather it's so we have some of the best researchers on the planet at the moment, right? Coming from DeepMind, coming from NVIDIA, different places on the world, and they're not just scaling training. They're here to actually do a lot of original, defensible, if you're interested in that, research.
Are there areas you're particularly excited about right now in research?
Absolutely. This kind of joint pre-training, early training, nobody knows how to do that. This is the holy grail of deep learning, basically. How can you consume all of the data? This sounds simple, but how do you do that? Very tough. How do you then also make all these models extremely interactive? That's huge, right? You can say, I'm going to train a 30 trillion parameter model and I'm going to take $1 billion for training, and I'm going to train on 500,000 GPUs or 100,000 GPUs. That's not good. We think that's not the approach. We think there's, first of all, so much headroom in the infrastructure and in the software layers that we have that people don't actually take. But most importantly, there's so much headroom in training as well, where you can actually do a lot more without having to scale these models by 1,000x, right? Or even 100x. So very succinctly, our path there is, instead of scaling the models by 100x and 1,000x and then making them extremely untenable for deployment and making them so expensive that nobody can have access to it, you rather want to train more intelligent models and train them on about 1,000 times more data.
Yep.
If you can do that, you can actually deploy. Sorry, but yeah, the conclusion of that, if you can do that, you can not only make them really fast, really cheap, but you can also deploy them in places and for use cases that people don't think today. So I think that's our thesis.
Something I really like is that on your website, you call out current limitations with Dream Machine. I think it was like morphing, movement, text. And so what needs to happen to make those better? Then what happens when they're solved? What do you anticipate to be some of the new use cases?
I think these will be solved very quickly, and we have made huge strides on that in Dream Machine V2 at this point. Think about it this way: small language models, especially early small language models, they would formulate small sentences, right? And those sentences would look good, but then if you looked at like a large paragraph that came out of it, it was like, what the hell is it talking about? That's
Start
more,
seeing some gibberish.
example. That's morphing. It basically kind of lost the plot and it started to produce something else, right? So when video models are morphing, like these universal models are morphing, that just means like, it was doing this action and then suddenly forgot about it, suddenly like, does not know how to finish that action, lost the context, lost the plot, those kind of things. It happens because, these models are just very small and very early.
Yeah. Universal models, they're just like us, they can't stay on track.
They will learn and they will get better and they will scale very quickly. I think that's basically premix solved. That's an engineering problem at this point.
The second part, I'm curious in general what you've seen as some of the most interesting use cases with Dream Machine. And then let's say you solve some of these short-term problems. What does it unlock? What happens?
Yeah. So once you are able to produce really coherent, cogent videos, um, you then can actually start to deploy them in use cases which are not just like, hey, I want to make a video to share it on social media, or I want to make a video to make a movie out of it. Of course, those are really important, and a lot more people will be able to do them. But you can actually bring these models into education. You can bring them into fashion. You can bring them into day-to-day consumption of information, honestly. That I'm extremely excited about because, of course, we want to democratize storytelling and how many people can tell their stories. But in addition to that, the promise here of these models that are intelligent, extremely visual, are able to follow through things and show you what is in your mind. The promise of that is computing. And I think everything you and I do on computers, we can do way better because we now have these models that can draw and paint and show anything and everything you want, and you can interact with it. So coming back full circle from the start, that's what you're able to do once you have models that are able to coherently generate these contexts. Same thing happened in language. Once you have models that are able to coherently generate code, the text, JSON, you can then start to use them for more than just text generators. You can start to use them as tool builders and tool users, all this.
What becomes the role of human creativity then? The universal model can do more and more. What stays uniquely human?
Everything that has always been uniquely human, right? Learning the minutia and the nooks and crannies of random tools is not what humans are about, right? Humans are about the larger motivations and bringing it to bear, right? Doing the fine work, doing the high end of the work, like those kind of things. So when computers came about, it's not like humans became less creative. Humans actually became insanely more creative. Think about all the things people do on the iPads now, right? I don't mean, of course, as a computer. iPad is a pretty poor computer, but the drawing and the painting and those kind of things, before, which was limited to very few people, photography, which was extremely limited to very few people. Now, it's just in your hands. And then what you and I do a day to day might not even look like photography because I just took photo of a Post-it note to just remember the damn thing because I don't want to carry a damn Post-it note. Not photography, but look how useful that is and look how important that is. It actually helps me run this company, right? Cameras are a big part of visual memory, and it now helps me run this company. That is extremely creative. Running and building big structures and big things is extremely creative. So here's my cookie pitch to you. Basically, if we want to climb up on the ladder of Kardashev scale, humanity has to become Kardashev scale, one civilization and then two civilization at least. We need to bring to bear all these technologies to accomplish bigger things. And if humans continue to be oh, I know DOS and I know Word and I know Excel and these are our skills, we're not going to get there. We need to be able to wield more and more of matter, more and more of energy, and more of information together. And that's not going to happen by using chisel and saws, right? That's going to happen when we can actually use these higher level technologies to do even higher level things and manipulate even bigger entities. So that's what happens to human creativity. Humans move on to doing bigger things and solving bigger challenges.
I absolutely love that. And when I hear you talk about humans doing bigger and bigger things, I can't help but ask. I've heard you're just a killer recruiter. There's someone you want, they're in Europe, you're on a plane the next day to close it. So, do you have any recruiting tips? Like, what makes someone a really good fit at a company like Luma?
I don't have any recruiting tips because I do like. It's not that I'm a good recruiter. It's that like see basically we end up hiring people who want to do this, who who see this future, and when they see it, maybe they hadn't seen it before or they were already far ahead of us on this future, but when they see it they cannot stop thinking about it, right? Like this is what they want to do. Like most people who are at Wima, right, they can honestly be anywhere. Like I tell this to anyone because like, you're so good at what they do. They can run companies, they can do whatever they want, but they're here because this is what they want to do. And like together we are better than the sum of our parts.
Yeah. So some of the trick to finding talent is they're thinking about the problem at night and when they wake up too, and they have this obsession factor.
Correct. Like basically, like once I gel with someone at that level, once we start talking about that problem, that's it. Then all we need to do is align the logistics of it, right? And flip side of that is when that doesn't work out, that doesn't work out, right? Like and I don't give a shit after that, right? Like that's great. They can do what they are passionate about, what they want to do. But if they're passionate about this, Luma is the only place on the planet that is doing this, and that they should be here, right? So then we need to do everything to make sure they're here. We need to solve all their problems. We need to make sure that they feel like we care about them, and we do. So we need to show it to them, like all those kind of things. We will do everything humanly possible once we have alignment on that. So honestly, if you're hiring, if you're a founder, those kind of things, be extremely honest. Be extremely honest about work-life balance that you have, whether it is bad, whether it's good. People who are driven will put heaven and earth together, right? And they won't be swayed away because like, oh, you work hard. Like of course we work hard. You don't change the world in 9 to 5. Nobody has, honestly. That's my mental model. So be extremely honest. Be extremely honest about the
Yeah.
challenges
This
you
is what you're
have.
signing up for. And if you're still excited, like we're excited and we'll do anything to close you and bring you in.
Exactly. Exactly. You tell them everything about the hardware challenges you have. You tell them about hey, I like we have these GPUs, but look, running them is like chewing glass, and it excites.
Yeah. So if you love chewing glass with the GPUs, come on board. We're brushing on time, so I'd love to just end, in a sentence. The person who is most obsessed with Luma, how have you changed as a person and a leader since you started the company?
Oh, I find myself unrecognizable since I started the company. Honestly, I didn't used to think this deeply about things when I started, right? Um, Now most actions I take, I think very deeply about what is the effect of it on our team, on our company, and on the path we are on, right? Like I think that has changed significantly.
I think the world around you right now is moving so quickly that if you don't think deeply, you're just going to shake around in that world too. It's a requirement to survive.
Exactly. You could just follow trend to trend to trend, and you would be so anxious about like, oh, they did this, they did that. Like, who gives a shit? You see it in your head, and you think this is it, and that's what you want to do, right? Also, how many things I can do as a person? I just didn't think it was possible to do that many things. And then I have some really, really fantastic people now around us. I used to be extremely no, I will do everything, right? If it is that's now when you find great people who are much better than you learn like, oh yeah, I don't have to do everything. So let me find the things I'm really good at. So that has changed significantly. Um, but yeah, founding a company is a joy of a lifetime. Honestly, it's tough. It's I have actually one thing is very interesting. You measure time in significant events that happen in your life, right? Like those are the bookmarks in your head, and like if not much happens, like that time just passes by very quickly, and you don't never remember it looking back. So significant happens. Things happen in most people's life, 1 or 2 things a year, right? My time has been such that I simultaneously have one of the best days I've had and one of the worst days I've had. Same day. And you min max so hard all the time. I have had to really learn to modulate myself. Like, I just don't know. Like you just like, balance out very quickly.
Yeah, it requires like emotional regulation, for lack of a better word, to survive the ups and the downs and the lefts and the right.
Yeah.
I so appreciate you sharing and coming on. Great to see you as always. Thank
Yeah.
you, Amit.
Thanks for having me, Bar, and appreciate you inviting me.